Hey everybody, Jason Morris here. Welcome to another episode of Streets to Suites. This is a community platform for the professional underdog. What we do on this show is we talk about the come up stories from professionals in our community. We start by talking about the street, meaning where are they starting from? And we have a really special guest here today, and we're going to talk about DE&I and what's happening in the world. And we have two known DEI practitioners, and we're going to talk about the power of your voice. To round out the show, we're going to end it by talking about what's the suite, what's next for the guest that we are interviewing today, and what are they looking for as they move forward into 2023. So, with that being said, it is a pleasure and privilege to welcome Gashard, global DE&I practitioner, to the Streets to Suite show today. How you doing?
Thanks so much, Kason. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be a part of this. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we worked together previously, so it's always great to bring folks. And also, I have my co-host with me, my brother from my actual mother, Mr. Kayvon Lee.
Yer. How you guys doing?
All right, this is an important topic right now. There's a lot going on in the DE&I space, and really that we're focusing on this idea of the power of your voice. So, Gashard, I would love to kick things off by just understanding what's your street. How did you get into the DE&I space? Where did things start for you? And let's go from there.
Yeah, very much appreciate again being here and the question. It's such a relevant question because when you're in DEI, your story is so powerful. For me, I think before even realizing it, I've been grooming myself for this career ever since I was young, from having experiences where I experienced microaggressions in the classroom, whether it was being stopped by police officers, whether it was higher education and having to realize that I was grappling with things my classmates weren't when it came, am I good enough to even be in this environment? So I think all of that really encompass my need to find the space where I can not only express my personal story, but make sure others didn't go through what I had to go through as I developed through my educational path and made it into the corporate space. And shout out to Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn, raised there my whole life, recently moved to Jersey City. And yeah, just looking forward to having this conversation. It's, as you said, it's a really important one.
Dope, dope. I did a stint out in Brooklyn, no pun intended. I used to live out there for a few years. Love the fact that we all happen to be local practitioners. There's a big correlation to the work that I do corporately in learning and development and the DE&I narrative. I feel like there's a lot of synergies there and they go hand in how to push it forward. But before we get into those details, let's talk a little bit about the focus of today, the power of your voice. Where is that inspiration coming from, and what drove you to want to talk about that today?
For me, truthfully, I've always been someone who's a little bit more introverted and someone who didn't necessarily always in the past find the forums to give my opinion or perspective. But I realized that if you're not speaking things into existence, someone is either going to surmise or decide for you what you're thinking, or they're going to think you're not there at all. And when I think of power of your voice, it can not only vocally, it's not only what you're saying in the room. Yes, that's important too, but it's also using your voice through the written form. How are you speaking things into existence through writing, unpacking things, speaking about narratives, things of that nature? So I eventually learned how to leverage and make both of those essential to how I show up in the work, in the personal spaces, and my ventures outside of my corporate job, and just making sure that I understand that my perspective is meaningful. And it ended up, the more I shared, the more it resonated with other people, I'd say.
That's deep for you. And then I would love for Kayvon to chime in. What are the skills you think that folks need to really develop that power of their voice? What are the core skills you would recommend that they should work on?
Yeah, I think it really does start with just practicing and finding ways to put yourself out there. It's really easy to get stuck on the habit of, oh, maybe what I have to say isn't that important or I'm not really going to share. But like, you have to set that goal. Is it going to be you're sharing once every opportunity you get in a team meeting? Are you going to take it upon yourself to take on a stretch project where you're presenting on a topic that is either familiar to you or new to you that requires you to do research? So I think just being able to say yes to things as they come your way. I think second, you have to do the research, do the back end work of being sure that you understand your industry or understand your topic to the best of your ability. You want to be able to speak confidently. And to be able to do that, you have to put in that work behind the scenes. A lot of the times, people aren't going to see how much work goes into your preparation, but that's the most important part. When that opportunity presents itself, you want to make sure you're already prepared for it. You don't want to get prepared when it's too late. You won't always know in advance, but try to do as much prep as you can. And I think last is just counting the small wins. Even if you, let's say, you start to fumble at the beginning when you share your voice, ask for feedback, but also celebrate the fact that you took that opportunity upon yourself to put yourself out there in a way maybe you didn't do in the past. So I think it's the combination on that last one of celebrating when you do this, but also seeing feedback as a gift and being able to say, okay, I can incorporate that. That makes sense. That piece of feedback that was shared with me, because that's going to make me better every time I share my voice.
No, I love that. One more quick question to sneak in there. Why do you think your voice is so important to diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I love that question. I think to me, a lot of what DEI practitioners do is influencing. You're an influencer. You're getting leadership buy in. You're unpacking complex strategies with the data to prove it. And you have to tie everything together, sometimes in a neat little bow, so that these senior leaders, these people that you have to influence across the business, understand the impact, the weight of what you're doing, and the goals behind it. So, being able to speak in a way where you are bringing people along on the journey, connecting the dots of how DEI is going to make us better innovators as a company, which will then make our bottom line where we want to go trajectory wise in terms of revenue, things of that nature. So, I think is a good thing to be passionate in DEI, but passion without being able to have a voice that sort of ties everything together and understands why these initiatives are important and why we need to set goals and why we need the data to prove it. All of that is part of change management, which is a core skill to being a DEI practitioner. You have to understand organizational behavior, top down structures, and how to be able to speak on this and leverage your voice to make action happen.
Real great points, Bashard. And as a practitioner, a lot of what you're saying really resonates with me. I think just top of mind, what came to my head when you were speaking about how you influence organization was my experience and my transition from government to the private sector, where government, it's like most folks already have the buy-in through the moral case. So there's really no need to plead the business case because folks know that we just need to do it. But transitioning into that corporate space, there's a added need of really pleading that business case and leading with metrics and numbers to really visually represent how DEI drives and maximizes a business performance. But that leads me to my question. Since 2020, we've definitely been seeing an uptick with DEI and it being $1 billion industry. Now with the impending recession, we're seeing organizations pull back from DEI. Wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and thanks for bringing that piece up. I think this is exactly what happens when firm commitments and firm goals are not set when you start to have these DEI conversations. And I'm speaking about companies at a high level when you don't once look at your insights, look at your data, unpack where your organization currently is. The next step right after that should be, okay, we're going to transparently post where we are in terms of this is our diversity makeup of underrepresented employees. These are the different levels they are at our company compared to our majority population. But then what are the goals? Are you going to set a hiring goals by 2026? We want our numbers, our diversity representation to look like this. By 2025, you want promotion rates of these particular groups that maybe aren't where they should be compared to the general population. We want to get it to this number. So when these goals aren't set, when they aren't somewhere visible, public on company page, these divestments are so easy for companies to make the decision. And they're ignoring the fact, that body of research around the fact that prioritizing DEI is what is going to make you more profitable. Going back to that business case we're speaking about, it's going to actually improve your numbers if you're actually making sure that this divestment doesn't happen, especially if you think of retention, the amount of dollars it takes to rehire talent after they leave. When you think about your recruitment efforts, you're going to want to make sure that you have DEI at the forefront, because the younger generation, they're so DEI forward thinking when it comes to seeing this as essential to a place they want to work. So as these younger generations continue to join the workforce, that's something they're going to be looking for. They're going to want to see what your impact measures are. They're going to want to see if you have employee resource groups. They want to have this as something to help them make the decision if they're deciding between whether to work here or someone else that shows a little bit more care and urgency around DEI and what it means. And last point I'll say is on this topic is it connects back to the values too. What values are cornerstone and essential to the company? Do they have a value around inclusion, around equity that you can see on their website, incorporating all these different voices? I think that's an important too, the goal setting, but also what are the values that are foundational to that company? Because if you have those two things present, it's going to be very difficult to easily say, okay, we need to cut funding somewhere. Let's just get rid of DEI and then that's it. That's the end of the conversations. I think, some companies are going to potentially regret this, but I'm curious to see what the findings look like 2023.
No,
Thanks for
that's
sharing that.
yeah, that's heavy. When I think about this idea of the power of voice, right? So now you talked about it in two contexts. You talked about the power of the voice of the individual, the power of voice in relation to your journey in DEI, but also what you just hit on was the power of the voice of the DEI function and how well it aligns to the values of the organization. That resonates for me as well because I think about this from the sort of correlated lens of learning and enablement. So it's like, how are you continuously skill building and embedding these practices and allowing organizations to make culture shifts to support DE&I initiatives? And I think we're in this space right now where 2 years ago, everybody was all about DE&I because of the environment that we were in. And now we're in another stressful environment, but in a different way. And now it's less about Black Lives Matter, and now it's about operational efficiency. So I find that it's very interesting with that pivot and shift with around inflation, that something that was evangelized so strongly 18, 24 months ago is now some of the first things that are on the chopping block. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's such a good point. And it's hard to see this, especially as a DEI practitioner. It's difficult to see companies saying, okay, this isn't as worth as much as we originally thought, or what have you, or however they're making these decisions. And even from an employee resource group perspective, in my current full-time role, I work specifically with our employee resource groups. We have a large network where I'm at now of about 2,500 to 3,000 employees. And there are companies that are saying that these employee resource groups, we're going to go away. We're going to get rid of them. We're going to get rid of them completely. We're going to strip the budget. They're not going to exist. And I think it's truthfully going to be traumatizing for some employees. This was seen, specifically speaking about employee resource groups, these are seen as safe spaces, safe havens. These are seen as networking opportunities. These were professional development incubators in some senses, mentorship spaces, all of that encompassed within ERGs being such a cultural add to any company. So within the frame of ERGs and within the frame of DEI, what's going to happen is HR and diversity, equity, inclusion are just going to have to have a much closer partnership moving forward. A lot of companies now, I'm seeing even a formal connection point or even joining those two teams from the HR side and DEI side to make it clear that these are two functions that need to be embedded and connected to each other. But it really can't stop there. It has to be, how are each pivotal verticals having a DEI goal or having a DEI partnership, from your product team, from your recruitment team, having like specific goals and metrics around DEI. That's what's going to make this a long-term conversation, long lasting, the more it is integrated across the business. But it's tough to see these changes happen, and hopefully companies can do some self reflection and introspect on, okay, how do we reprioritize this if we see this as having an impact on our retention numbers, who's leaving after we make these divestments, things of that nature. I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation.
Yeah. It's not just compliance practice, it's truly business practice. So I have one other question right around that. So for those who are listening to this episode and they're on the come up, they want safe places to work. What should they be looking for in companies to make sure that those companies have the right kinds of alignments and investments in D?
I think for me, at least what I've done at the very baseline level is, when you look at the company website, what are the photos, especially if they have authentic, real photos from events? What does the makeup look like? What does the leadership team look like in terms of the representation, not just at race, ethnicity, but even gender, looking at that? How do they speak about the different functions of DEI? Like I was mentioning before, the values. Is there speak of values, not using generic language around whether we have DEI goals, whether there are certain initiatives that are really important to us, whether there's external partnerships with a nonprofit where we have this connection that we know this is important. And I really think the piece that is going to be spoken about even more, which companies that are further along the journey already do this, is equity. How are we speaking about equity? Because it's one thing to get your diversity numbers up, it's one thing to start to recruit this talent from different backgrounds. But if you're not retaining them, and if you don't know how to make sure equity from, okay, we need a program specifically for our Latinx population because we looked at the data and maybe they're not getting promoted at the same rate of others. If we're not talking about equity in that conversation and you don't see this as a candidate, start to incorporate these questions into your interviews too. It's something I always do. Like, what are some diversity goals that you know of across the company? How does leadership speak about DEI and its importance? What do you do as a people manager to make sure that you're equitable in how you make decisions on, let's say, high visibility projects? There's so many ways to go about asking these questions, but I think sprinkling in a couple in each of those interviews you might have will ensure you get to decide, okay, how authentic are they? How fit can they get intangible, either examples or metrics or anything that shows me that, all right, this company and this team actually cares about DEI and what it means to me as a potential candidate.
Felt that.
That was really great, Rashad. Just a follow up, and I think it ties into something that you shared earlier. How would you challenge organizations to push themselves within the DEI space? I think oftentimes we find that orgs who invest oftentimes do it to check a box. Once they check that box or meet said goal, they become very stagnant or nascent, and they think that their DEI journey is. And we're seeing that through like organizations like the $1 Billion Roundtable, where you'll get a token for essentially investing billions of dollars of revenue to minority businesses. But if your organization is somewhere north of 50 billion, what is that 1 billion really doing? Are you really driving your impact? So I'm curious, how would you challenge organizations to make sure they're getting out of that check the box framework and really invest intentionally in DEI?
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity area is, how are you connecting DEI initiatives, strategy towards your leadership? I've seen some companies make it a habit to have a bonus or compensation structure related to actualizing on, executing on DEI goals. So these having to be a priority area if they want sort of those rewards, to reap those rewards of the full bonus package or structure they have set up where they are. So really putting those dollars on the lines for leaders. I'm not saying this is the only way, but it's one way of making it effective. But I think it has worked. I think being able to say, okay, this is something that you should continue to prioritize, and being able to also have 360 feedback, I think is a really big piece of this too. Companies that make feedback in an organic conversation, make it something where, let's say, a people manager can get feedback from their direct reports or their team on how inclusive of a leader do you feel I am, and having that play a role in their overall review process. That's a big piece too. So not only just saying we're going to do this or we're going to have this on a website, but how are we embedding this to accountability for our senior leadership, but also people managers, and making it a habit to include this in performance conversations, whether you have quarterly check-ins or end of year reviews, setting goals around DEI, but also, okay, how can we measure how impactful or effective I was? And typically, I've seen this done anonymously to make it more of a safe space of sharing. But those are just two measures that I think of top of mind when thinking about this.
If I could chime in really quickly, I like that you spoke about measuring it. I would like to know, are there any examples of businesses that are doing it right? Are there any examples that you can call out where it's like, hey, this company is doing it the right way? Because I'm still like new to this. I know a lot of the reason why I left the workforce, or for a lot of the underlying reasons that you bring up and talk about in the workforce, and just like code switching and not really feeling comfortable. But yeah, I would love like to know, are there examples of companies that are doing it right where like people should, or other companies should take notice and get pieces from? So
Yeah, I'll definitely do a shout out to Expedia Group. So Expedia Group, they have IND reports that they execute and push out publicly every year. And this gives a huge download of all of the body of work that's being done in the IND space, from transparent goals, from transparently speaking about the makeup of employees, telling employees stories on what initiatives have been meaningful and resonated with them to get that voice in. And they also do a large body of work on disability inclusion and tying that into the product. Like, for example, having an option on the Expedia website to then go to room bookings and say, okay, I actually need an accessible room for, let's say, my wheelchair. So being able to actually filter for rooms that you need for your priority needs just to be comfortable in this hotel from an equity inclusion perspective, that's a real body of work not every company has been able to delve into. How are we leveraging those internal conversations to then impact how we show up for our clients, our end users of our application or our website? So I think that, and even employee research groups, having senior leaders as executive sponsors that are really authentically showing up for these groups, mentoring them, amplifying, highlighting the work that they do throughout the year, and then figuring out how they can embed this into their strategies for the departments they lead. So yeah, I think companies that show up and post about their work throughout the year in inclusion reports, like Google is another big one. I believe Dell and IBM have a few resources they share about their impact on their websites, thinking off the top of my head. So the more they showcase things tangible, sometimes I even just find myself Googling 2022 diversity reports or things of that nature to get a better understanding of what's happening in the space. But those names I threw out there are some of the top ones I know of. Salesforce is another one that does a lot of disability inclusion, incorporating all the different perspectives and underrepresented employees with specific goals as well.
Okay, Vaughn, weren't you involved in putting together some of those reports for New York City?
Yes, sir. Making
That's
the grade
awesome.
report from the comptroller's office. We pretty much looked at the 32 mayoral agencies and graded them on how well they spend with minority women businesses.
Mm,
Essentially, through that, we help drive their DEI initiatives through contracting and procurement and supply diversity lens.
that's amazing. Yeah, that's important work. Yeah, it's awesome.
No, a very powerful topic. There's some crazy nuggets here, some real takeaways for those who are listening and are business practitioners. We've lined up and discussed a lot of approaches to think about. It's not only about a seat at the table, it's about how our business is setting the table with aligning key metrics and values around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And furthermore, are making the point around even thinking of beyond just equity, you think about accessibility. I know as a learning practitioner, that's what I think about is like, how are we designing in an equitable way for those who may have issues and challenges with reading text or things along those lines. As we wrap this up, Gashard, I would love your sort of final thoughts on what are things that those who are listening who want to do more or learn more about DE&I, where should they go? What should they do? How can they stay engaged? And then if you could, after making that statement, just add a little bit around what's your suite as it relates to this topic or something personal where you're going next for 2023 around this idea of the power of your voice.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And to me, you'll be surprised the different areas where you can find really powerful information around DEI, whether it's from people I follow on TikTok, whether it's from LinkedIn. Just happened to early on in my career, for those who are interested in getting in the space or just learning more, I really find myself just hashtagging diversity and inclusion or finding leaders speaking about this. I'm trying to be more consistent to speak on the topic as well. So really use LinkedIn as a resource, but also I think a few places that I get a lot of good information is from McKinsey Insights. They post periodically on DEI, what's to know in the DEI field right now from women in the workplace, what are some of the statistics, or why has it been such a struggle or hot topic when it comes to microaggressions and underrepresented employees coming back to in-person or hybrid roles. Why was that a topic of conversation and the anxiety around that? So McKinsey Insights, I'd say Diversity Inc. is a big resource. They have like newsletters where they speak a lot more on the government side of things too, and some of the changes to legislation. I think that's a really important part to keep up to date with how legislation shifts across the US, or if you're in a global role, other regions, countries as well, because this impacts how you show up and what topics of conversation are pivotal when you go into your day-to-day role. And sometimes you may have to have a meeting that comes up where you're holding a safe space or a council meeting about some legislation that was just passed or something that was banned regarding human rights or LGBTQ plus rights. Think of recent examples over the last couple months. But I think those are a couple, just in finding the right people to follow. McKinsey Insights, looking at some of their newsletters, and Diversity Inc. They have a really great display of newsletters as well. And I think for me, when I think more about getting at the second question, what's next for me in 2023? One part is I really want to find out more ways where I can support people who look like me, people from underrepresented backgrounds, from a career coaching perspective. We hinted a little at that topic of, okay, what should people look like when it comes to these job interviews or finding authentic companies to work for that aligns with their values. But I really want to take what I've learned, but also I have a master's in HR. I've taken a couple courses in the career coaching space. How can I being offering to people? And I already volunteer my time for those who reach out to me, but being more of a vocal, okay, would love to set up time with you if you would like to connect. And I think for me, the second part of that is I really want to delve more into the mental wellness, mental health side of DEI. I have considerations in my mind of whether I should focus on getting a mental health master's at some point, because DEI connects so much to how certain experiences impact you mentally, how Are you able to show up to the workplace even though maybe externally you've seen all these news articles that really don't sit with you, have bubbled up and caused anxiety? I'm even considering whether it's on a one-to-one basis, showing up as a mental health professional. There's not enough people of color doing that work. I have my bachelor's in psychology. I was considering in the past as well getting this master's in that space. So it's something that's top of mind. The wheels are turning on whether I should reprioritize that, because you really, for some of the topics, when you think about getting therapy or speaking about your personal experiences, you're going to want someone who can validate and truly, authentically understand what you've been through. Because even I've had experiences where in the past I may have explained something to a therapist and I can tell they didn't get it, not only from how they responded, but also just from the space and how it was held for some of the things I've spoken through. So something that I'm really thinking through to consider for my 2023 journey. Expecting it to be an exciting year.
Nice. I appreciate that share. Kayvon, any closing thoughts from you?
Just one question. If you had any advice that you could give to your younger self, what would it be?
Yeah, that one is a tough question for me because it requires a lot of self-reflection. But I think for me, it's you don't necessarily have to lose the parts of yourself that you appreciate in order to incorporate new pieces of yourself. What I mean by that is a lot of the times when I was younger, I disliked the fact that I was a little bit more quiet, or disliked the fact that I was, and this connects all to power of voice too, where I was a little bit more to myself. But I realized having that foundation gave me pivotal skills to the career I'm in now, where I'm able to self reflect before speaking on a topic, where I'm able to be introspective, where I'm able to understand environments and emotions in an environment more easily, where I'm able to have this emotional intelligence you need to do this work. Yes, maybe I could have been more vocal as I'm younger, is something I'll tell myself, but don't let that destroy or dampen those pieces of you where you were able to build empathy, and you're now using those skills to this day. So I think that'll be my message if I ever find a time machine. I feel like sometimes I think back to, it wasn't really a time machine. I think back to that show Family Matters where Urkel would turn into Stefan, but that was a whole different that was a whole different thing. I was like, was that a time machine? No, I haven't seen that show in a while. But yeah, I think that would be the message.
Amazing,
Nice.
amazing.
Yeah, no, we appreciate you leaving us with that message. And if I could just recap it, thinking about this, the power of your voice as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion within yourself and also for where you work. I think of for three kind of key big buckets. This idea of setting a table for yourself and figuring out what stands out to the story that you mentioned about yourself and others. What can you call out and change? For institutions, I think the idea of setting that table is, can they offer and create space where DE&I work is really aligned to business priorities with core metrics and values in place? The idea to keep learning, to tap into community, to touch on different assets and resources, valuable resources that you mentioned on the individual level. So for those of us that are listening who want to delve into the space, to keep learning and leverage folks like yourself, as well as those available resources from research houses like McKinsey. And then on the corporate side or the organizational side, small business side, whatever you want to call it, it's really fostering a learning culture toward diversity, inclusion, and belonging, where people can draw from their unique experiences, like the experiences you've shared today. And I think the last but not least theme for me, when I think of the power of your voice, is staying engaged. So at an individual level, it's speaking up, practicing, keep making sure that you're building that muscle, because it's not inherent within us, especially in our workspaces, but then also in our life spaces. And then for the corporate side of things, the idea of creating communities and creating spaces where there's power in belonging. So to the example you mentioned, having ERGs, having all those alignments where you're really holding yourself to that accountability for increasing your voice and increasing the voice of your employees where they work. So Gashard, thank you so much again for your time, for for sharing your Streets to Suites journey in relation to this topic, the power of your voice. And this is Kason Morris signing off for the rest of the Streets to Suites crew. And we'll see you next episode.
Thank you
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Appreciate the time.